September 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic had already become the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, and the stakes could not have been higher. Over 3,500 Allied merchant ships had been sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. 72,000 sailors had died in the freezing water. Britain was being slowly strangled, requiring over 1 million tons of imports every single week just to survive. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. After years of devastating losses, the Allies had finally turned the corner. In May 1943, 41 German U-boats were destroyed in a single month, forcing Admiral Karl Dönitz to temporarily withdraw his wolf packs from the North Atlantic. Victory seemed within reach. The convoy system was working. New technologies like centimetric radar and improved sonar were tilting the balance. Allied sailors allowed themselves to hope that the worst was behind them. They were wrong. On September 20th, Convoy ONS-18 was steaming westward across the North Atlantic to Sicily when the impossible happened. A destroyer escort, HMS Lagan, was struck by a torpedo that seemed to chase it through the water. The torpedo had turned. It had followed the ship. This was not supposed to be possible. Over the next 48 hours, as ONS-18 merged with another convoy, ON-202, the carnage continued. 3 escort vessels were sunk. 6 merchant ships went down. The escorts, the very ships meant to protect the convoy, had become the primary targets. German U-boats had deployed their newest weapon, the G7ES acoustic homing torpedo, codenamed Zaunkönig, meaning wren. This was Germany's last roll of the dice in the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was devastatingly effective. The acoustic torpedo represented a revolution in naval warfare. Unlike conventional torpedoes that traveled in a straight line, the T5 torpedo listened. Built into its nose were hydrophones, underwater microphones, that detected the sound of ship propellers churning through the water. Once launched, the torpedo needed no further guidance. It was fire and forget. It simply followed the noise, homing in on its target like a bloodhound following a scent. And nothing in the ocean was louder than a destroyer racing at full speed. The physics were brutally simple. When propellers spin fast enough, they create an effect called cavitation. Cavitation. Low pressure forms on the blade edges, creating vapor bubbles that collapse with explosive force. This cavitation generates tremendous noise that travels for miles underwater. Sound moves 4.3 times faster in water than in air, and exerts 60 times more pressure. A single destroyer could be heard from 5 to 10 nautical miles away. An entire convoy's combined noise signature could be detected from 50 miles. Deadly paradox. The speed that made escorts effective against submarines, their ability to race ahead and drop depth charges, was exactly what made them the loudest acoustic targets in the convoy. Every time an escort commander ordered flank speed to pursue a U-boat contact, he was essentially ringing a dinner bell for acoustic torpedoes. No defense. ASDIC, their submarine detection system, could locate submerged U-boats, but could not detect torpedoes. Radar saw nothing underwater. The weapon would simply follow the loudest sound until it found its target or ran out of fuel. In London, the Admiralty faced a crisis that threatened to undo 2 years of hard-won progress. If escorts could be hunted and killed with near impunity, the entire convoy system would collapse. Without escorts, merchant ships would be defenseless. Without merchant ships, Britain would starve and the planned invasion of Europe would be impossible. The war itself hung in the balance. Scientists and engineers were given an urgent mandate. Find a solution. Find it fast. The breakthrough came not from complex electronics or sophisticated weapons, but from a beautifully simple insight into physics. If the acoustic torpedo followed the loudest sound, then the solution was to give it something louder to follow. Engineers set to work. They adapted existing equipment used for acoustic minesweeping. They took two hollow metal pipes, drilled holes in them, and created a device that, when towed behind a ship, would bang and rattle through the water. As water rushed through the holes, the pipes clattered together, creating cavitation noise 10 to 100 times louder than ship propellers. That amounted to 20 to 25 decibels louder, which represented exponentially more acoustic energy. The British called it Foxer. The Americans called it FXR. The Canadians called it CAT. The German U-boat crews, who could hear the distinctive rattling through their own hydrophones, called it Kreissäge, the circular saw, or Rattleboche, the rattle buoy. On September 23, 1943, just 3 days after the devastating attacks, the British Admiralty issued an assessment of the new device. Their evaluation was brutally honest. The Foxer was hard to stream. It was short in endurance, destroying itself after about 25 hours of use. It hampered maneuvers and restricted ships to 14 knots. It made the ship's own sonar useless, as the rattling drowned out the ability to hear submarines. Perhaps worst of all, the noise advertised the convoy's position to every U-boat within listening range. The Admiralty admitted the Foxer was a flawed solution. They deployed it anyway. By the end of September 1943, barely 1 week after the first attacks, every escort vessel crossing the Atlantic was towing a Foxer. There had been no time for laboratory testing, no months of trials and refinements. Ships tested the system while under active threat, refining deployment procedures through trial and error in combat zones. Sailors learned to stream the device in rough seas, to manage the towing cables, to accept that their own defenses were partially blinded by the very noise that kept them alive. This represented one of the fastest military technology deployments in World War II history. When lives hung in the balance, bureaucratic hesitation evaporated. The results were dramatic. Germany fired approximately 700 acoustic torpedoes throughout the war. Only 77 found their targets, an 11% success rate. Of the 32 escort vessels hit by acoustic torpedoes during the entire war, only 7 were towing noisemakers when struck, and at least 2 of those were likely direct hits rather than acoustically guided successes. Without the Foxer, the success rate would have been catastrophic, potentially 40 to 50% based on the early September attacks. Instead, Germany's last major technological advantage was neutralized within weeks. The acoustic torpedo, which should have reversed Allied gains and restored U-boat supremacy, became just another failed wonder weapon. The innovation worked because it exploited the torpedo's fundamental limitation. The hydrophones in the torpedo's nose could only home on the loudest sound source within detection range. This was a necessary compromise, given 1943 technology. There was no way to make the guidance system smart enough to distinguish between a ship's propellers and a decoy. Once the torpedo sensors locked onto the Foxer's noise, physics took over. The torpedo circled the rattling pipes until its fuel ran out, and it sank harmlessly into the depths. Simple mechanical ingenuity had defeated sophisticated weapon technology. The story of the Foxer is really the story of anonymous heroes. We do not know the names of the engineers who adapted minesweeping equipment into life-saving countermeasures. We do not know which scientist first suggested that louder noise could be the solution. These people worked under crushing time pressure. Every day's delay meant more sailors dying in the North Atlantic. But we do know the merchant mariners who benefited from their work. These were the true unsung heroes of the Battle of the Atlantic. American merchant mariners suffered a 1 in 26 casualty rate, worse than the U.S. Navy's 1 in 114. 9,300 American merchant sailors were killed. 8,651 British merchant Navy sailors died. They transported virtually everything the Allied armies needed to survive and fight. They sailed knowing the odds, knowing that the next convoy might be their last. And for decades after the war, their sacrifice was forgotten. They were not granted veteran status until 1988. They did not receive the Congressional Gold Medal until 2020. The New York Times captured their treatment perfectly during the war. No one stepped up to the bar to buy them drinks. No moist-eyed old ladies murmured, "God bless you." The cop on the beat, gentle with soldiers and Navy men, was apt to put his nightstick to a merchant sailor who had celebrated his rescue from the sea a little too heavily. On the other side of this tragedy were the U-boat crews themselves. German submariners suffered the highest casualty rate of any service in modern warfare. 75% were killed. 30,000 men died out of a force of 40,000. These were teenagers and young men following orders, dying in steel coffins at crushing ocean depths when depth charges found their mark. The Battle of the Atlantic was a tragedy for both sides. The Foxer was eventually supplemented by electronic noisemakers and more sophisticated countermeasures, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged. The modern U.S. Navy ANSLQ 25 Nixie torpedo countermeasure system, still in use today on aircraft carriers and amphibious ships, uses exactly the same concept. A towed acoustic decoy generating noise louder than the ship it protects. The innovation born from desperate necessity in 1943 still saves lives 80 years later. Victory in the Battle of the Atlantic came from convergence. Centimetric radar that U-boats could not detect. Radio direction finding that located their transmissions. Escort carriers that closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Enigma code breaking that revealed U-boat positions. And yes, the Foxer, neutralizing acoustic torpedoes. No single innovation won the battle, but each one mattered. Each one saved lives. The Convoy system held. Britain survived. The invasion of Europe proceeded. And somewhere in the archives, unnamed engineers and scientists can take credit for one of the war's most elegant solutions, turning sophisticated enemy technology against itself, with nothing more than hollow pipes and the physics of sound.